Hey guys, it's Danny. Today we're gonna see how to go about a brand new orchid which might be in need of help when we don't have orchid supplies. And I find the subject quite fitting considering the time when I'm uploading this video, but I will also try to answer a few questions that I did get along the years about when we need to repot new orchids, how should we go about certain things, and so on and so forth. So it's not only going to be about how to handle things without proper orchid supplies, but also trying to determine exactly what our orchid needs. Now, first off, our new orchid might actually not be in need of repotting or intervention at this point. If you have no possibility of getting orchid supplies, it's perfectly fine to keep your orchid in the initial medium it came with, although, yeah, honey, I know, it's not ideal as you can see, but it's not actually harming anything. It's not functional. The pot is certainly a little bit too tiny for the orchid, but overall, the orchid is not in distress. If we make sure to water it properly and give it good external conditions, everything should be okay, and we can keep it like this for a month or even 2 or 3, depending on the orchid, before we actually have to intervene. So first of all, do try to assess the situation of your orchid. There are instances in which orchids really need help, and these usually refer to the medium. When you see that the roots are already very damaged and the medium smells super bad, maybe it's infested with snails, or who knows what's wrong with the medium, if you feel you need to get that orchid out of that situation, then obviously you should do that. But you can intervene and take care of your orchid even if you don't have supplies. So let's see how that would look like. Before we start, a really quick note that applies right now to the situation we are in. Rather than you going out and finding supplies, if you really need them, check to see if your local stores actually deliver. They might actually be closed to the public, but they could deliver in safety conditions. Because the truth is, right now, everybody's affected, including businesses. So supporting them is actually not a bad thing, but if you can do so without exposing yourself to risk, that would be great. So give a call or look on the internet and see if any nursery or store delivers to your area. Alrighty then, so here is my brand new orchid looking a little bit sad, and look at this medium. It's absolutely not suited for this orchid. But what if I don't have my preferred medium, I don't have my gloves, I don't have fertilizer, and I don't even have my beloved orchid pots? No worries. We can still intervene for this orchid, and here's how. First of all, we absolutely need to get this orchid out of this pot and out of this medium. It just so happens that this is the Just That Ice orchid, and it came potted in this, I believe, cocoa fiber plug. As you can see, the orchid is not even growing her roots inside the plug, and also this plug is not very suited for orchids once they become a certain size or a certain age. So first, let's remove this plug. And P.S., we don't necessarily need gloves when working with orchids. I do like to wear gloves because I have severe dried hands, and washing my hands multiple times a day, it's not funny. It can get rather painful and my skin cracks usually, but it is what it is. At this moment, the gloves can be put to better use, and I can just put a little bit more cream on my hands. But what do you know, when we try to remove this plug, the roots are not coming off very easy from it. And this is because we need to saturate it with water. Now, if you have hard water, on the long term, it's not okay for orchids, but if you have no choice, if you have no soft water at your disposal, hard water is absolutely fine. So first, I'm gonna soak my orchid in the decorative container that it came with. You can soak an orchid in whatever container you have, and I'm gonna let it be for a few minutes to properly saturate this medium and roots, just to make everything a little bit more flexible and easy to work with. Now, the problem with hard water is that that amount of calcium and magnesium, which is usually contained in hard water, will not be consumed by anybody. So in time, it will start to deposit on the top of the medium, on the roots themselves, And that's when the damage starts, not when the salts are dissolved in water. And especially with fresh new roots, when they're starting to grow, those root tips are very sensitive to excessive amounts of salt. So hard water actually affects the orchid in time, as it dries over and over and over on the roots in medium and starts to create those patches. But if you use it once or a few times, most of the times it's absolutely okay. Alternatively though, you can actually collect rainwater or melted snow. Rainwater is very low on nutrients, so it will not have any salts to build up. You don't necessarily need distilled water, so if you have rain at your disposal, use it. If not, just stick to whatever you have. Okay, I think my little orchid is quite soaked, so let's see if we can remove this plug now. It's definitely much easier to work with, even though, can you see, it's not completely soaked? This is the problem with this material. It can be really hard to water orchids in this material unless you properly soak them, because this material, in time, becomes a little bit compacted, very hard to wet, and overall, it's just not ideal for epiphytic orchids. But while they're seedlings, it can do the job. And here we are, most of this medium is gone, and can you see the root tips? Didn't look all that great anyway. This orchid really needed our help. Alrighty now, the next step is to rinse these roots at the sink very well, and that's pretty self-explanatory. I'll come back when I'm done and I'll remove all of this medium from my tray. So I rinsed the roots of my orchid, but now I need to cut away all of these dead roots. And usually how we go about this is by using a sterilized pair of pruners. In our case, let's presume we don't have alcohol, or that alcohol can be put to better use somewhere else. You can use any scissors you have in your house, and you don't necessarily need to sterilize it. As long as you did not cut any other plant material with it, you can go ahead and use it with your orchid even without sterilizing it. Alternatively, you can go at the sink and just wash it with a little bit of soap, and that will be pretty good. Another very good method is by using a flame. If you have a flame stove or a lighter, you can just go ahead and put that flame on the blades, and that will do a very good job at sterilizing it. And since you might be wondering, no, alcoholic beverages might not do the trick because they're simply not strong enough. We need 70% alcohol or higher to properly disinfect this pair of scissors. But as I was saying, there are multiple ways of going about it, and if you just have a pair of scissors which you've never used with plants, that is perfect. So I'll go ahead and cut all of these dead roots which look dried. I'm gonna see if I have any mushy roots. Look at this one was mushy. And here's something interesting. On many orchids you will see this scenario. You have a patch of dried root or dry development, and then you have green root. What should you do in this instance? Well, you can just let it be. Phalaenopsis typically can have dried patches of roots without the root actually being dead. It's just the development that got affected by something. So if you have a root which has a dried patch but then continues into healthy green root, let it be. However, if you have something like this with a dried tip, you can safely remove this one. So I'll go ahead and cut away all of these roots that are not healthy on my orchid. And my orchid looks much better. Next up, I would typically use hydrogen peroxide 3% on the root system to make sure that I get rid of bush snails and their eggs. But let's presume that I don't have the substance in my house, and right now, I really don't need to go out and buy hydrogen peroxide. Well, there are two scenarios. When it comes to Phalaenopsis orchids, I personally have never seen bush snails on their root system. Whether they simply don't appreciate the roots or Phalaenopsis simply don't taste good, I don't really know. But in the past 7 years or so, I've never seen bush snails, and I personally never spray Phalaenopsis. I like to save my hydrogen peroxide for other stuff, such as oncidiums. But let's say we're not dealing with a Phalaenopsis, we have a different orchid, and you do have a bush snail infestation. What you need is a container with water, because you can absolutely soak the roots of your orchid and let your orchid sit like this for a few hours. what will happen is the bush snails will need to come to the surface and breathe, so you can definitely see them and just get rid of them. The orchid will be absolutely fine a few hours in water, but just make sure that after all of this is done, by the end of the day anyway, you take it out and you dry the stem or the rhizome or the base of the pseudobulbs, particularly in between the leaves, very, very well. You don't actually need to submerge the orchid that much. This would be enough just to make those snails come to the surface. This method will definitely take care of the mature snails, but you will also have eggs, and I doubt it will do anything for the eggs. But the good thing is we're not actually going to pot this orchid right now. So if you're not potting your orchid, definitely you can repeat the process at a later date, or under normal circumstances, when you go out to get yourself some medium, you can buy the hydrogen peroxide as well. This is not normal circumstance though, but luckily for me, I can keep my orchid bare rooted as long as I want. Hence, there's no need for hydrogen peroxide just yet because I'm not potting my orchid, so I will be able to see those bush snails if they decide to come back. Next up, I would go ahead and pot my orchid. Well, for that, I would need medium and a pot. Well, let's say we don't have the orchid pot. Where is it? This guy. Well, we don't necessarily need it if you think about it. If you have a transparent container or a transparent cup such as this, you can easily transform it into a pot. All you need to do is put some holes in the bottom and on the sides to mimic these side slits. And to do that, you can use either a heated nail, either a soldering iron. I'm not sure if everybody has a soldering iron in the house. Maybe a nail you might be able to find, but if you don't have any of these, you can get your little pair of scissors and you can do one slit here. And that's your drainage. You can let it be like this, or you can put another one here. And on the sides, very carefully, you can go ahead and create some ventilation holes. And there we have it. Easy peasy, right? So in this case, if you do have some medium but you're missing the pot, hey presto, you can create a pot super easy. If you don't have a transparent pot, you can use any other type of container or any other type of pot. Orchids don't actually need light to their roots. Yes, they can photosynthesize through roots, and this is an adaptation to their natural growing pattern and their natural environment. Since the roots are exposed to light, then why not photosynthesize as well? But the main function of roots is water absorption and nutrient absorption, not photosynthesis. And I do actually have a series both on roots and on leaves in which I talk at length about these functions that these two structures have. You can check them down below in the description. But in my experience, the photosynthesis carried by the roots cannot compare with the one carried by the leaves. So by not providing light to the roots, you're not actually harming your orchid. You can pot this orchid in a terracotta pot, which is completely opaque, in whatever you like. It doesn't need to be transparent, but obviously if it's transparent, you can see the roots and see how they're doing, so there are advantages there. It's just not mandatory. Alternatively, of course, you can reuse the pot the orchid came with. Just wash it with a little bit of dish detergent and it's ready to go. The problem with these pots is that they typically are a little bit too tiny for our orchid. In the vast majority of cases, our orchids simply outgrew it. So this is useful for a different orchid, so we're not gonna throw it away, but depending on your orchid, you might actually have to go for a different container. Now let's presume that the container is not the problem, but the medium is. We don't have any type of medium. What will we do? Simple, we will not use medium. Most of the orchids on the market are actually epiphytic. Even oncidiums, even dendrobiums, even miltoniopsis, really, so they don't necessarily need that medium. The role of the medium is to help us because it retains water, it delivers water to the orchid, and in this way we can go about our lives not having to constantly spray the roots or making sure that the orchid is hydrated. So the medium is just our friend. It's not essential for them. So especially with Phalaenopsis, what you can do is keep it bare rooted if you intend to keep it potted afterwards. Alternatively, consider keeping it mounted. And I do have videos on mounting orchids. Pretty much it means attaching it to a piece of wood or even a piece of terracotta or a terracotta pot and keeping it without medium. I personally am not a fan of these setups simply because I live in a very hot environment and I don't have the time to keep up with watering, but many people do use mounts and it can be a nice little setup to at least consider. So I will link you down below to my thoughts and my experience with this type of setup and a little bit of care tips when it comes to mounted orchids. So if you have a piece of wood lying around somewhere, consider using it. Or if you know you want to use medium in pots eventually, then you can definitely keep your orchid bare rooted. One way is to keep it in a jar like this. Another way is to keep it outside of the jar, maybe like this if it sits. Another way is to keep it like that. It's gonna be absolutely fine if you leave your orchid on the table in this way for a day or two. Trust me, nothing bad will happen to the orchid. It doesn't need to sit upright. The stem needs to be dry, but other than that, the orchid doesn't care for a day or two if it sits like this. If you have extraordinary circumstances such as now, do try to find a little glass. It doesn't need to be plastic, it can be anything you have in your house, and just maybe sit it on top of it like this, just to give it a little bit of a home until you can safely go out and get yourself some medium, and everything should be absolutely fine. How do you water this thing? Well, pretty much how you would water any mounted orchid, which I will insert a clip down below in the description of. What you would do is, as I showed you at the beginning, fill the pot with water, let it sit for 5 minutes to soak up, dump the water. Hey presto, your orchid is absolutely done. Now, depending on your environment, you would need to soak your orchid once a day or once every 2 days or so. I would not let it be for a week because it has no medium to help you out with that water. So whatever your orchid drinks in those 5 to 10 minutes, that's it. When the roots are dry, the orchid is not drinking anymore. So that's why with bare-rooted orchids or mounted orchids, it is necessary to water a lot more frequent. So I hope you can see why it's not the setup for me, but hey, under the circumstance, I'm perfectly fine with the setup. I don't need medium, I don't need pots, and if I can get to them in 1 month's time, my orchid will already be super healthy because this is absolutely perfect for it. Next thing we will consider is fertilizer. But wait, I don't have any orchid fertilizer in my house. Should I go out and get some fertilizer? No. First of all, brand new orchids don't need fertilizer. For a little while, they will work on adapting to the new setup, to your new environment. They will typically not grow fast. Hence, they will not need a lot of fertilizer. And most epiphytic orchids do have stored nutrients, either in their leaves or roots or in their pseudobulbs. So even if your orchid is starting to grow, you don't necessarily need to fertilize it just yet. Orchids grow as slow as they do because they're perfectly adapted to harsh environments where rain, nutrients, and other luxurious things that terrestrial plants find in soil are not available to them. So they're perfectly adapted to withstand a really large period of time without any type of fertilizer. Deficiencies will probably start to show within a year or so. So if you don't have orchid fertilizer and you don't have access to fertilizer for a month or two, it's perfectly fine. You absolutely don't need to fertilize your orchid. And most of the times you will not even feel that the orchid is deficient in any way. If you start fertilizing afterwards, everything should be perfectly fine. Alternatively, other types of fertilizers can be used, although I don't recommend you do that if you're a beginner and you don't really know much about orchids just yet. Better not fertilize than over-fertilize. However, if you really must, you can actually use other types of fertilizers. Typically, African violet fertilizers are weaker than your normal standard fertilizer, so they can actually be used with orchids. But if you just have a normal all-purpose fertilizer, just use a quarter of the recommended dosage on the label, and that will make sure that you're not over-fertilizing orchids. Compared to many other plants, orchids are not heavy feeders. They grow slow, they might not have blooms all the time, they don't have a super big extensive root system like terrestrial plants do, so they don't need as much food. So again, I wouldn't recommend you just get whatever fertilizer you have in your house and dump it on your orchid. Just wait. But of course, if you absolutely really must, you can use other types of fertilizers as well. Other than that, temperature and light and humidity levels, they should be the same as you would have them for normal potted orchids. And as you might already know, I do have a full series on Phalaenopsis orchids. If you missed it, I'll link you to it down below. There are 11 episodes only on Phalaenopsis orchids. And I do talk about supplies there as well. And it's a good idea to actually learn a little bit more about your orchid and see what would fit you better, because there is no universal potting mix for Phalaenopsis, no universal fertilizer, no universal way of going about things. So if you're unsure what type of medium to buy, what type of pot you need, the size of the pot, and all of these things, do check the description down below. I'll share with you my series. And until you can get to those supplies, this will absolutely be fine. Your orchid will not suffer, trust me. And that's about it for today's video. I hope these tips will help you in a pinch when you don't have orchid supplies, and especially now with the things being how they are. And I do want to take this moment to address you on a more serious note. I want to urge you to follow the rules the authorities have in place in your area. And at least when it comes to orchids, you don't need new orchids, you don't need new orchid supplies. Your orchid will be perfectly fine. These guys are perfectly adapted to very harsh conditions. Things can absolutely wait, and they're not worth you going out and putting yourself at risk. Save those moments for going out for food or medicine, or for going to work if you have to go to work. I know that you might see some people here on YouTube acting irresponsible and escaping quarantine, but we're not escaping anything. Breaking quarantine harms all of us because it puts us all at risk. And in the past few days, as well as I'm sure in the following days, you will see quite a lot of irresponsible behavior on YouTube, on the internet, maybe on TV. Please don't follow that example, even if you like the creator. We're not perfect human beings, and sadly, not all of us realize that we might actually have an impact on our viewers. And if any YouTube creators are watching right now, please remember that when we do YouTube, we not only sign up for the benefits, but also for the obligation. And I know that we cannot be responsible for everyone, but we owe these people watching us at least a good example on camera. So please, let's do that, because it's so important that we do that right now. Let's not make ourselves sick or the ones we love, and most importantly, let's not burden the healthcare system, which is struggling as it is. Let's not make the life of these people harder by going out and getting orchids or orchid supplies. Please don't do that. So with that said, I'm gonna end it here. Thank you so much for watching. As always, give a like or a dislike. Subscribe for more orchid videos, more light-hearted videos, hopefully very, very soon. Follow me on Instagram and Facebook. Consider visiting the merch store. And with that said, have a great weekend. I'll see you next time. Bye.